Dr. James Kirkland received his PhD from the University of Colorado. He spent 2 years teaching at the University of Nebraska and 9 years as a paleontologist with the Dynamation International Society before he joined the Utah Geological Survey. He spent the last 18 years as Utah's state paleontologist. So in that job, he issues permits for paleontological research on Utah state lands. He keeps tabs on the paleontological researchers and issues across the state. And then he also promotes Utah's paleontological resources for the public good. So he's an expert in the Mesozoic. He spent 40 years, 40 years, excavating fossils across the southwestern US and Mexico. And he's co-authored or authored more than 80 papers. Some of his interests include the reconstruction of ancient marine and terrestrial environments, biostratigraphy, paleobiogeography, paleoecology, and mass extinctions. He has discovered and described numerous new dinosaurs, including several new armored dinosaurs, bipedal plant eaters, the oldest truly horned dinosaur, North America's first sickle-clawed therizinosaur, and the giant dromaeosaur raptor, Utah raptor. His research of the Middle Cretaceous of Utah indicates North America separated from Europe about 115 million years ago, followed by a period of isolation and the origins of Alaska, with the first great Asian-North American faunal exchange occurring about 100 million years ago, which he's researched with his numerous trips to Europe, China, and Mongolia have all substantiated. The Jurassic Cretaceous boundary dinosaur extinction and recovery are taking up much of his attention lately. So I've known Jim for many, many years. He's the organizer and leader of truly spectacular field trips. So if you ever get a chance to take one of his field trips, and I had the pleasure of actually not only going to his field trips in Utah, but also going with him to China. So there was a particularly memorable occasion. We were going to Liaoning, China, shortly after they discovered the feathered dinosaurs there on a trip to see that. It involved overnight trains in China, which we had sleeping quarters. Sleeping not so much. It was pretty rough. And so we were waiting in the restaurant before we got on our overnight train, and there was Jim sleeping in the corner, trying to recover from these long endures. So we got some blackmail pictures from that. But anyway, I'll take away, Jim.
So hopefully you see this right here. This is my old stomping grounds back in the 1990s. This is the Fruta Paleo area. And I could have spent my whole career working in this area because it's pretty amazing part of the planet. But basically today I'm going to discuss what we've learned in the Morrison Formation in this region about dinosaur nesting in the Upper Jurassic. As you'll see, the data we have from the Upper Jurassic is pretty focused, really on one animal where we have enough data to say anything. But obviously it was nesting widely through the region. So now the Morrison Formation, of course, is one of Utah's most famous formation. It probably is the most famous formation for dinosaurs in Utah. And, the real Jurassic Park. And, we have hundreds of miles of outcrop that have barely been looked at and in these strata. And we have, it's famous for Dinosaur National Monument and what's now Jurassic National Monument, the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry. And probably one of the biggest single sites in all of at least the Jurassic in North America, not the entire Mesozoic section, is the Hanksville Burpee Quarry, which I always tell people, think of 200 dinosaur national monuments laid out end to end over a 2-kilometer stretch just under the surface. And, with the same kind of density of skeletons of Upper Jurassic dinosaurs as you see at Dinosaur National Monument. Incredible locality. They can be digging on it for 1,000+ years solid, and it'll still be going on. But our Morrison fauna is one of the best known Jurassic faunas in the world. There's well over 100 taxa known from the Morrison and more than 20 dinosaur taxa. But the general pattern we see in the upper Jurassic is, it's dominated by sauropod dinosaurs, the large long-necked dinosaurs, a diversity of groups, but probably the most abundant animals that we see there are the diplodocids, things like Diplodocus and Barosaurus and Apatosaurus, and now resurrected Brontosaurus. Haplocanthosaurus is considered an early diplodocid. Very abundant sauropod dinosaurs all through it, and a large number in diverse group of large meat-eating dinosaurs. You have the allosaurids, the ceratosaurs, megalosaurs represented by Torvosaurus, Marshalosaurus, which is probably more of a megalosaur grade animal, just a bit smaller than Torvosaurus, and the early Tyrannosaurus Stoxosaurus. So you see, they're dominant animals. It's also, of course, famous for its Stegosaurus, of which is pretty widespread throughout the western basin for the Morrison. But just keep this in mind. We're not going to talk about the JK boundary, but the base of the Cretaceous, none of this stuff's there. So we're now pretty comfortable that my new research area is now the Jurassic Cretaceous dinosaurian mass extinction. But that's for a later talk. The Fruta Paleo area is located just to the southwest of Fruta, Colorado, the very western part of Colorado on the other side of the Colorado River. I used to live in Fruta for about 9 years, and I was literally within 10 miles of this spot for that entire period of time. So I could ride my bike over there and look at things, and it's extraordinarily exciting and fossiliferous locality. Now, in 1975, George Callison, who was professor of biology at Cal State Long Beach, mounted an expedition with some of his undergraduate students. Two of them are right here. Jim Clark, who's now, I think, getting close to retirement as a professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and Mark Norell, who I think has now retired from the American Museum of Natural History. But this is when they were undergraduates, before they made the big finds and the work they did in Asia. That's people know them best for. But on this expedition, George, he was out looking for mammals, small vertebrates. He was definitely looking for small things. And Jim Clark stopped on this little hill over here, just behind his head, and sat down on the edge of that little rim there to tighten up his bootlace. And as he was tightening up, he looked over to the side, and one of these kind of white rocks you see here, this bed, this is a flood deposit, very fine sand. He noticed some little black dots. When that was prepared, it turned out to be a vertebral column with ribs and other parts of the skeleton of a small terrestrial crocodilian. And that really changed Jib's life. As they worked in the area, they found a lot more parts and fragments of this animal. Here's a little press picture, George Callison's digger finds a croc of crocs. But these were always referred to in the area as bunny crocs, because they were small skunk raccoon-sized animals that would have been important small-sized predators within this landscape. And after Jim had found that, they started prospecting that horizon, because that's one flood deposit wraps around here. You can see it through here. And they were prospecting very carefully. And right in here, where Jim is whacking away with his pick to move some overburden, Mark Norell found the cross section right through there, the front below that large tooth right there at the front, this mammal jaw. And all you could see was the edge, but you could see that shiny enamel above this cross section of bone. Knew he had a jaw, and they knew they had a mammal site. So that began about almost a 20-year period of exploration of this area and intense excavation of this particular layer for many years to come, and produced dozens of important fossils, including many mammals. Here's George Callison back in the 80s, working on the main quarry there. We always call it the Callison Quarry. He lived with hand lenses on his visor, so you can look at these little tiny dots. Nicely, the bone is generally black in a white matrix. So even in cross-section, a tiny little limb bone of a small animal would show up really nice. You can see there's some nice 3D mammal skulls. There are lizards, the oldest snakes in the North American continent. Was it Dinosaurus? Finally been named. Here's a little mammal skeleton here at the bottom. And rolled up, that thing would just about sit under a quarter. US quarter or Canadian quarter for that matter. Here's the back end of a little lizard skeleton. You notice it's only the back end. And then we got a part of a sphenodonid. These are animals related to the modern Turatara, which is a living fossil, lives on a few islands off the coast of New Zealand, but was a very important part of the fauna in the Jurassic and early Cretaceous of Western North America, and actually globally. Very important group. But if you look at that little back end of a lizard, I always think of this floodplain as representing, animals just dried out and, desiccated. So, semi-arid savanna. I'm definitely not a big fan of the thoughts of some folks that it's a rainforest. It wasn't. The soils tell us there's salt in the soils. You don't get any salt in soils in a wet environment. So I picture these little dried up carcasses, just laying on the surface. And then eventually there's a big rainstorm, flood, and they wash into the pools. And this is one of those pools. Now, as I said, the FPA is a whole ecosystem. There are ponds that preserve lots of plant fossils, wood, conifer branches, ferns. There's the microvertebrate sites. We have some ponds that preserve complete fishes in the site. We find caddisfly cases. We have trace fossils that show that there were termites and other things living in the environment. So it really shows us within about a square mile, square kilometer, a complete ecosystem. Very, very well developed in that we have the plants, the entire, the smaller end of the food chain, turtles, crocodilians, mammals, lizards, all the way up into the big dinosaurs. Now, the first report of eggshell in the Morrison Formation, at least what Carl had told me, was from the Callison Quarry. Because as George was digging there, some of these little black bits, they were little tiny flat black bits. They'd clean them, and basically they turned out to be little fragments of eggshell. Now, these things were, the person you go to on this is Carl Hirsch, who's the father of North American paleontology, the study of fossil eggs. These are some of the fragments of eggshell from that site. There's some eggshell that Carl identified as turtle egg. You notice this is 0.5 millimeter thick. These are real small, thin eggshells. And then the avian-like eggshell is 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters thick. And other than this first paper that was published in '98, where Carl did a little super overview of Morrison eggs, this stuff's never been looked at again. But this avian eggshell could be from real birds, given the size of it. Very, very small, thin eggshell. Now, how do you study eggs? Of course, it's always best. Had a chance to go work in the Gobi and see dinosaur nests and excavate some of this material. It's always best if you find eggs and whatnot. But of course, like with Protoceratops, we thought these nests were from it. And later we found its brooding oviraptor sitting on the eggs, like the Cipati, its famous egg oviraptorid sitting on its eggs. this has happened multiple times. These things were living in an environment with big sand dunes, not that different from what it is today. And during big sandstorms, they'd go over to, and try to protect the eggs, protect the young, and the dune would collapse and bury these animals on top of their own nests. One thing that's really interesting, as you'll hear a little bit more about, is we don't have eggs of things like protoceratops, but these little theropods, these derived Maniraptoran theropods, have very, very well preserved eggs, and we have many, many examples. Now, what are the eggs? Eggs, basically an ability, a form to allow the embryo to be developed outside the water. And we developed, in our ancestors, the base of the amniotes, an amniotic sac around the embryo. You can see within an egg, that's pretty far down into the egg itself. But this is what helps give the embryo, a self-contained environment in which to develop outside of the water. Huge innovation. We're all amniotes, lizards, everything above amphibians or amniotes. And typically what we end up getting to work with are broken pieces of eggshell. These little bumpy pieces here, the outer part of the eggs, the smooth surfaces here inside of the eggshell. And we look at the structure by which the eggshell was formed. And that's, biologically, that's touched to the soft tissue structures within the oviducts of these animals that laid the minerals down that form the eggshell. So this is actually a pretty important taxonomic character because you're looking at soft-bodied tissue being reflected in these things. So when you attach these to animals, you have a character in terms of looking at family histories of these things. It's actually rather important. Here's a nice picture of Carl Hirsch. I shared an office with Carl, or an office area with Carl, for many years. He was a retired draftsman at Rocky Flats Research Area. And when he retired, he was a real avid fossil collector. And, he was up in Wyoming and found I think it was Eocene, maybe I think it was a Oligocene. He found a fossil egg. And he started saying, well, what is this? What kind of egg is it? How do I tell what kind of egg? And no one had a clue. No one knew anything. And Carl took it upon himself to start really digging in and, figure out, how do you tell eggs apart? And he's really the father of North American egg research and eggshell research, pretty much the father of it globally. But the sweetest guy in the world, and it was so nice having known him for about 20 or so years. But if you look at the different eggs, they're characterized on external features and cross-sectional features, how the calcite forms, or in some cases aragonite, forms in the eggshell. And one group down here, these oblique prismatic shells, seem to belong to Dryosaurus. And that's the animal we're going to talk about the most in this story today. But different kinds of eggshells do tie to different types of animals. In modern eggs, this is where you start, the present is the key to the past. Looking at modern eggshell in cross-section under a scanning electron microscope, you can see there's very different and repeatedly different structure of the eggshell itself. Versus turtle, this is gecko egg, down here, crocodilian eggshell, and of course, bird egg. And the pores, this is how oxygen gets in and out of the egg. And I know, talking with Carl over the years, because he knew I was playing with some nesting stuff, he was always like trying to get me to create an exhibit with Dynamation on how eggs are like houses. But all the air that goes in, the oxygen goes into the egg, goes in through these little pores, and the carbon dioxide leaves the same way. So this is, how they respire is through these pores. So here's a pore in a crocodilian eggshell. And this is one of the limits to how big an eggshell you can make, because these fine pores, how many pores can you put in an egg to keep it structurally sound? have a lot to do with the size of eggshells. Once again, the diversity of eggshell is pretty great. You can really tell a lot of different groups of eggshell together. Titanosaur sauropods seem to have a variety of eggshell types. And of course, they produce some incredibly thick eggshell, very distinctive stuff. This is very well known from Europe and Argentina and Asia as well. And some of these eggs we can tie Longulithus. Basically that group of eggshell is basically bird eggs and Maniraptor and theropod eggs. Makes sense. They're related to each other. And ornithopods really do seem to be tied to the Prismatoolithid group of eggshell, which is pretty interesting. So, this stuff, it's tied to taxa to some degree, but there does seem to be a lot more variety in some of these other types of eggshell. Now, if we look at these nesting sites, it's interesting. They group in a fairly narrow band across western Utah and central and western Colorado or eastern Utah. And the stars down here all have eggshell associated. Dinosaur National Monument is listed because there's baby Dryosaurus, that have been found up there, including skulls, which have been very useful in looking at these things. So there is babies up there as well. Now, with all that, 5 kinds of eggshell in the Morrison, but where's the sauropod eggshell? I mean, sauropod eggshell is massively thick. I don't see any way when we're finding eggshell that's 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters thick. Now, we would miss eggshell that's on the order of 4 millimeters thick to almost 5. I mean, big, thick sauropod eggshell should preserve really well. And there's never been a piece of it ever found within the Morrison Basin, which extends from Montana. Actually, there's equivalent rocks in southern Canada, but from basically Montana all the way into central New Mexico, northeastern Arizona, Oklahoma, west into central Utah. Big, huge area. No sauropod eggs. And I always thought, well, maybe they're laying them outside the basin, that they migrated. We're talking a lot of different taxa. They all leave and are laying their eggs in Iowa or eastern Kansas or, places where we just don't have the rock record. But it's been proposed that sauropods did not have solid eggs. And William Diller Matthews proposed at the AIM&H, just as a passing note in a guidebook for the collections at the American Museum, he suggested that some or all of them may have been viviparous, like Ichthyosaurus, having live young. But he was of the mind that these things were so big, they were aquatic animals. 1915, there were still a lot of people more than 100 years ago that thought these things were just too big to spend much time on land. Bob Bacher came up with a similar theory, but from a completely different point of view. He basically said, they were too large to lay eggs, given the size of the big sauropods. The young would be so small, that they, basically couldn't follow the herds of sauropods that he envisioned. And he noted that big pelvic canal that sauropods had, suggesting, they had live birth and they gave birth to big young, large sized animals. Notice the protoceratops with the egg here. I like the duckbill with a much smaller egg. They're actually pretty good size. But one of the things that's been recently proposed, and it makes sense, considering the different type of eggshell we see and the different dinosaur groups that we have eggshell for, is that the basal dinosaurs did not have hard-shelled eggs. And hard-shelled eggs were developed independently in several dinosaur lineages, so that the protoceratops eggs were flexible. So here's an egg in Musosaurus from South America, and it's interpreted as being a soft-shelled egg. that's, an interesting theory. Also, if you look at ceratopsians, we have nests full of babies of protoceratopsians, as we see here. So Tachysaurs, this mother with all the babies, not a fragment of eggshell in these sites. And the preservation of these sites is such, we should see eggshell there. As eggshell, the protoceratops, there's eggshell number of dinosaurs in that site, but there's no eggs associated with the protoceratops nests. I tend to think they live in burrows, personally, and lay their eggs in the burrows. That's research to do, go after it. But this is an important thing to keep in mind. So basically, when we look at sauropod eggs, as from Argentina, look how thick that eggshell is. They're as big as soccer balls. And basically, this is probably the maximum egg size. This is about the size, even though they're perfectly round, of a elephant bird egg, except they're more ovate, more egg-shaped. These things were spheres. Roll down the hill, they just keep going. But if you look at the eggshell, given the pores are real tidy, this is almost certainly the maximum size you can have an egg. Because if you make the egg any bigger, because of the brittleness, all the crystallites are going across this, the eggshell would collapse under its own weight. So you can't do it. And you can't have it thicker because there wouldn't be enough oxygen, carbon dioxide exchange through the pores in the eggshell. So, you've got this limit on how big an egg can be. So this actually, when we start looking at this, we realize titanosaurs are the only sauropods that we know with eggshells. And we have them in Europe, we have them in Asia, we have them in South America. Titanosaurs laid eggs in big colonial nesting areas, though they now consider their nests to individually only have about 10 eggs or so. So they're having fewer young in a clutch than we see with a lot of other dinosaur groups. So were the Morrison sauropods viviparous? Were they laying large babies, a couple at a time, of large body size? Or were their eggs just soft-shelled and we just don't see them preserved? We don't have a lot of baby dinosaurs in the Morrison. Certainly not in the size range of the baby stuff we see in Argentina. So it may push that maybe Bob Bach was right. A lot of people hate Bob, but maybe Bob Bach was right. And these things were viviparous, at least the diplodocids. This needs to be pursued more. Okay, the first eggshell that was found, well, as I said, it was probably from the Fruta Paleo area, from the Callison quarry. But one eggshell fragment was reported in 1987 from Garden Park in central Colorado. And it was just a little fragment. I think it might be from the Delphi quarry, which is down in the salt wash, the lower part of the Morrison. But back in 93, fairly complete prismatoolithid eggs were found. And you can see a group of them here that were prepared. So, we know they're eggs that are fairly complete, and there's a nest. I think this is Tim's egg site is the name of this. It was reported on first in 93, and a little more work was done in 98 when it was really described. But 87 is the roots of this. The first egg, though, remember that egg wasn't found until 93, those eggs. The first dinosaur egg ever found in the Morrison Formation is this egg from Jurassic National Monument, the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry. And this egg, Cleveland Lloyd Quarry, there's a lot of interpretations of what's going on there. It's a mass mortality site. Site that preserves, incredible number of Allosaurus, our state fossil. Something of 54 skeletons have come out of there so far, or at least representatives of 54 animals. Total growth series of these things in that quarry. So it's a predator trap, and it's a mud hole, without question. So you find an egg, that's not where you think they would be nesting. And it makes sense when they find the egg and looked at it, that it was a pathologic egg. basically it's multi-layered. You can see the outer layer here. So this thing was in the birth canal, and for some reason, maybe whatever killed the mother, it was pulled back, and a new layer was put on top of the first layer of egg. So this might be that this pathologic egg was aborted when the animal died in the Cleveland Lloyd quarry or nearby. But it's a pathologic egg, and this would not have been a dinosaur that could have ever hatched, given the nature of the eggshell. But look at the structure there. I don't know if Darla Zielinski's in the audience, but she might know more about this eggshell than I, because a lot of people say, "Oh, that's probably an Allosaurus egg." I don't know. With the structure, I can't tell you, and I haven't really seen this paper. A quarry that I've worked in for about 9 years was the Mygat Moor quarry. I ran it for Dynamation for many years. It's a big mud hole bone bed. Most of the bone is down this lower part of the sequence in here, fish horizon up in here. Lots of Allosaurus shed teeth. It's about 20% Allosaurus. So there's a lot of Allosaurus in the quarry, and a lot of Patasaurus in the quarry itself. But basically, in this site, I found an egg. In fact, I was doing a demonstration on how you open the quarry and how you looked for bone as you worked. And I opened this thing. It's like, what is this? First, I thought it was a small turtle. And as I realized, this is a little egg right there. And there's eggshell. You can see the shell attached there. There's eggshell. And this thing was collected. It's in the Museum of Western Colorado. But this egg, Emily Bray, one of the people that were trained under Carl Hirsch, looked at it, and she says she's never seen eggshell quite like it. It's not a big egg, because that's a nickel there. So it's about, the full thing would be about, it's oval, 2 inches long, an inch across, 2.5 by 5 centimeters in size. You see all the plant debris in this mud hole. Once again, this would not be an egg you would expect in this kind of environment. There was a second egg, much smaller, and that's pretty small. That's very avian-like, and it might have been a bird egg, symbolizing the eggs. There's that egg, and there's another egg in the lower part of the bone bed. But they're mud hole eggs. So it's a thing to consider from this big dinosaur bone bed. And one thing I always thought was found in with the bones of an animal that's near and dear to my heart, Mymorpelta, the first Jurassic ankylosaur, which has turned out now the holotype's the most complete ankylosaur found in the Morrison. We got quite a bit of skull material, but we have almost every single bone in its body now and all its armor. So it's much more complete than Gargoylesaurus in many, many ways, except for the skull is not as complete. And they're different taxa. But could that egg be from this animal? There are no eggs from any armored dinosaur known anywhere in the world. So that's a pretty far off guess. But since these things were developed independently in a number line, who knows? Research needs to be done. So much of this is more research over and over. So now let's look a little bit closer in at some of the more important sites for eggshell, and these will include the young egg site, and we'll jump over to the sheets nesting site, and then back to the fruit paleo area. Now, the young egg site was found by Robert Young. It's in the salt wash, the lower part of the Morrison, this very sandstone-rich interval. There's the top of the salt wash. That's the base of the early Cretaceous buckhorn conglomerate. Actually, there it's Burrow Canyon Formation above the brushy basin. But there's the egg site. It was under this sandstone ledge, and a lot of eggshell occurs in this site, certainly more than could possibly be represented by one generation of nesting. Bob Young was doing geology out there, and he was, extraordinarily good geologist. After the war, and he was very active in World War II. At the same time, Carl Hirsch spent most of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Russia. Not a good place to be spending much of your time. Out in Siberia, it was pretty miserable. Carl and I have talked about it. It wasn't the high point of his life. And Bob and him didn't get along well. So I always thought maybe Bob's still holding a grudge. I don't know how you could do it with Carl. He's a sweetheart. But anyway, he got his PhD at Ohio State University. Long career as a geologist and lots of brilliant research in the Jurassic Cretaceous, Colorado, and so much work in my mind that was important that I named a sauropod dinosaur for him, Mirasaurus, Bob, young guy. Sadly, he passed away before he knew that I actually was naming this dinosaur for him. The young egg site, as I said, is in the salt wash, member of the Morrison Formation under a sandstone ledge. I see lots of eggshell fragments. Carl Hirsch in 87, measuring a jacket as they're analyzing this thing and slowly taking blocks out so they could be prepared in the lab. There's Carl again overseeing excavations. Harley Armstrong, the paleontologist at the time of the Museum of Western Colorado, and Carl overseeing a block being hoisted into the truck. But this is the whole type locality of the dominant egg known in the Morrison Formation. It was originally named Prismatolyphus coloradoensis, renamed by Darla Zielinski and Bill Hill in 1998. Because Carl pushed, you got to do this, pushed him hard to do it. Darla said, it wasn't me. I love Carl. I'm not going to change his name. But pre-Prismatolyphus coloradoensis. And that's the name of this kind of an eggshell. Here's the microstructure of this eggshell and the columns of calcites you see in the structure. It's somewhat of an oblique, prismatic type of shell. You see the pores go down oblique, and they tend to be oblique and then go more vertical, closer to the inside of the egg. When they were excavating around this stuff, they basically sacked the surrounding matrix, the ground mass, so they could screen wash it, look for small vertebrate fossils. Harley, and I was at the museum one day. I come over there, the Museum of Western Colorado, and Harley goes, Jim, you got to see this. And he shows me the back half of this little crocodilian skull. I pulled it out of one of the sacks of matrix. I'm like, holy cow, we got to look for the rest of it. And spread that thing out on the floor. Eventually found the front end of it. So it's pretty much a complete little terrestrial Mesoeusuchian gray crocodilian. I've been emailing Jim Clark, who is an expert on these things recently. Jim, you've studied this. This was on loan to you for a decade. Is it the same as the one from the Fruitopaleo area? And he says, nope, it has a very different palette, very, very likely related, but it's still an unnamed taxon with a complete skull. Someone needs to micro CT scan it. Jim probably already has. So it's like Jim's very careful researcher. They reopened the site when Rebecca was there, and her husband John Foster was the paleontologist there to screen wash more of the material, see if they could find any bones in the site. They didn't find any more skeletal material of anything in the site, just lots more eggshell. So even though it's a small site, a lot of eggshell. And it seems, they still think maybe two nests, but it's still a small site, but with lots and lots of eggshell concentrated into one spot. I once relocated it, and I could follow the trail of eggshell downhill for half a mile. That's how I found it. The parking lot, there's eggshell, and followed the eggshell trail up the hill to the site. In 1972, a few years later, this 12-year-old kid from Delta, Colorado, found a bunch of little dinosaur bones on the side of a dirt road near Uravan, Colorado. And his family was out on a field trip, a picnic. It's a kind of a tradition out here in the spring to go out and family picnics on Easter weekend. And he found this stuff, and he contacted dinosaur Jim Jensen at Brigham Young University, who was the main dinosaur guy in the region at that time. And dinosaur Jim was really impressed. He said, yes, these may be baby dinosaur bones. And Jim contacted a specialist, Peter Galton, in ornithopods. This started, I think, a pretty long relationship between these guys. But basically, Galton was able to identify this as Dryosaurus bones. May not be the species Altus, but maybe. I mean, Altus is tough to tell for little ones like this. But they published a paper the next year, right out, just published this paper on these juvenile bones of, they called it a hypsilophodont. We now know it's a basal iguanodont, Dryosaurus altus, from Western Colorado. So Rod Sheets did good for a 12-year-old kid. Should have been a co-author on the paper. Would have been his first paper because he's published other things, became a hypsilophodont expert, ornithopod guy, and he's now the director of the Brigham Young University Paleontological Museum. So Dr. Rod Sheets reopened his site along that road. They wet screen washed tons of material, him and his family and volunteers. And it was very successful. I mean, they washed a lot of material. And they're just picking stuff out of the screen boxes. Who knows what else might have been in there. But as it turns out, the entire site seems to have been bulldozed when they built the road. So everything that they were able to find anything in was in the road debris on the side of the road, which is very sad. Is one reason you want mitigation, though I doubt anyone would have noticed this site before it was disturbed. But as in the wash, they got lots of eggshell. They didn't have any eggshell from this site in the early years, and lots of little pieces of eggshell and some serious baby bones. As you can see, these little vertebrae. There's this neural canal, these tiny little vertebrae. So these are like embryonic and hatchling bones of little Dryosaurus. Here's a fragment of a tooth and a jaw. Here's a little tooth, that was loose, by Lincoln's nose. So you can really get a feel, for the size of these babies associated with this site. And, here's Dryosaurus elderi, used to be called Altus, from the Carnegie Quarry up at Dinosaur National Monument. And basically, there's a whole growth series for this animal, from little baby skull, there's just the baby blown up, to large probable adult or subadult skulls. So we really know something about its growth history already, just from Dinosaur National Monument. And when the material, which was hundreds and hundreds of bones and bone fragments, statistically, I don't know if I don't think it was ever statistically analyzed, but I looked at the material, Rod looked at it. It's really obvious, two size classes. Juveniles, not adult. There's no adult bones in the site whatsoever. But juvenile bones that probably represent like yearlings and babies that are probably, maybe even, out of their broken up eggs or died in the nest, on hatching. But babies and juveniles, two distinct size classes, very significant. So now we'll go to the next site from the Sheet site up north to the Fruta area in my old backyard. Now, thanks to a lot of diagenic enhancement of flood deposits, we're able to track these flood beds throughout the region. And you see these white layers here. These are like we see at the Mancallison Quarry over there. Basically, these are flood deposits that have been cemented by carbonate, so they're a bit harder than the surrounding rock. Very fine sand, almost, super fine, almost but very fine sandstone. And if you look, trace them around, you can see the relationships of all the different environments on the floodplain. As we come to where I'm standing on a river channel right here, I look over to here, and there's levee deposits. These are actually go up higher than the channel itself. In fact, up above me on this channel, above this channel, are abandoned channel boggy marsh deposits with lots of plant debris. There's no plant debris out here in these more alkaline, salty beds. Little barite nodules, it's definitely not a very wet environment. Lateral to permanent water above the channel. But you see these flood beds, trace them around the entire area and work out the floodplain. I basically consider this the best known square mile of Morrison anywhere in North America, square kilometer. We're able to trace out, say, that river, standing on that channel right there, looking at those levee deposits, see them going toward the main quarry. The main quarry comes down, and to the northeast of the main quarry, there's this big pond. It had some of those lizard skeletons and crayfish and things, but it's full of barite nodules, barium sulfate things. It was, big puddle that formed between the levee deposits on the side of this channel and these sand-rich splays at the bends. So where these channels came together, this channel, this big flood event, it switched over to here, then comes back and reoccupies its original course. But where they come together, there's a high, a ridge on either side of those sands. And this pond, whenever there's a big rain, would form behind the pair of ridges that came together in the downslope direction, giving us these perfect little skeletons preserved, where more robust bones are up in the Callison quarry. Now, so we look at this thing, if we look over toward Outlook Hill, this little knob here, I'm basically standing on the Callison quarry looking due west. So the main quarry bed is up in here, going across, and basically it fades out as we get into this area where we have levee deposits, this splay on this corner from this river channel here, which is actually an older river channel. So it kind of laps up on that and stops. I measured a section here, and I trenched it, which is what I learned to do. To understand the rocks, you got to dig a big trench of fresh rock, sweep it real clean, and by sweeping it clean, you can really describe it in detail. And I did that periodically through this whole area when I was studying this place, and found a site. And this is what I found initially. I'm sweeping the floor of this trench. I think you can see part of the trench right there above these folks. There it is there, going down, buried it here. And as I was sweeping it in this time at this interval, here's the main quarry level, the Callison quarry, this 2 flood beds down, sourced from another river channel. I found all this black bone. Oh, here's something nice. And realized, those are teeth. Preparing this specimen turns out to be a skull of a little terrestrial crocodilian. This was named by Jim Clark, became the holotype of Brutacampsa callisoni. And there are several skulls there. I don't think this skull is the same as this skull here. But they got several skulls of these animals. They're beautiful, beautiful preservation. And it's described as a basal Meso-Usuchian grade crocodilian from this site. So we got 2 different taxa of these little bunny crocs, these raccoon skunk gill type of animals. And here's what we think one of those animals would look like. Long legs, gracile, fairly running animal, these big fang teeth up at the front, but a fully terrestrial crocodilian, similar to what you would expect in the late Triassic and early Jurassic among the crocodilians. Now, when we start looking at this, we see the main Callison quarries are through an interval. You see it's bracketed. It used to be just up here, but we got quarries down here too. And these are all above a bed that we refer to as the clay change. And below this, the slopes are flat to slightly concave. concave. And these are from elytic clays, just your normal clay. If you're going to, sculpt, it's kind of clay you want to use, just a normal, clay. But when you get above it, we get swelling clays. And up here, it weathers convex. Volcanic ash does this because it breaks down into spectite, these swelling clays. And when they get wet, they expand. So instead of having a flat to concave surface for a weathering profile, they form a convex surface that bulges outward. So if you're mapping, you can map this level through the region real well. And Maureen Steiner did a study back in the 90s based on sections in northern New Mexico. And she didn't do the stratigraphy the way I would like to have seen it done. But she realized that the lower part of the Morrison Formation, when she did paleomagnetics, and the upper part of the Morrison Formation had two different pole positions. Now, these are circles that represent clouds of different pole positions. Now, if this had been continuous deposition, the lower cloud of pole positions should have merged into the upper cloud, as North America is moving. That's what we're seeing is the relative motion of North America. The pole wasn't there, was actually would have been over the water here, but that's where it is relative to this place today in northern New Mexico. But you see, these are two discrete pole positions. So the paleomagnetic pole down here was different than the paleomagnetic pole here. That suggests a break in time, an unconformity. And I refer that now to the J7 unconformity. I'm working on a manuscript right now that talks about the J7. But I mentioned it. I first brought it up in 2006 in a publication. But it's a good break. And there's often a paleosoil at that position, representing that missing time. This is what you get. Here's the paleosoil. It's not a hugely developed soil here, but there's carbonate in it and whatnot. Here's some splays below the clay change. And, you look here, it's convex weathering, flat weathering. There's a very big weathering change across the clay change that you can mark this throughout the entire Colorado Plateau region. And it fades out as you go into Wyoming. So by the time you get into northern Wyoming, there's no clay change whatsoever. In fact, the distribution of the clays is completely different. And what people always thought at first, the clay change represented the volcanic episodes in the Southwest turning on, because we get some ectitic clays from the breakdown of volcanic ash that produce a lot of excess silica that gives us nice agatized bones and petrified wood, and these swelling clays. So it's the breakdown of fine glass, this powdered glass that volcanic ash is mostly made of. Below it, there is no ash is known. So the clays are your normal tempered weathering clay from weathering previously existing rocks, and they're not swelling clays. But instead of the volcanoes turning on like a light switch, we think this represents a gap in time. And when its deposition really began again, the volcanoes were going at full steam, and probably is tied to renewing the depositional pattern we're seeing. So basically, working up there, as I said, I lived out near there for many years. I had a student intern back in 89, 90. It was Randy Neidham. He grew up, he had grandparents in Grand Junction. And he was, we weren't paying him, but he just wanted to learn about paleontology. So he came out and worked with me for a summer in that area. Now it's Dr. Randy Neidham. He's one of our experts on fossil lizards. I'm the one that said you should work on lizards. No one else does. We lost Richard Estes. It's an open field. We need someone to do it. And he started studying lizards. But he teaches down in near Phoenix in a school that cranks out doctors and specialty nurses. There's probably 7 paleontologists there now. vertebrate paleontologist, teaching various anatomical courses at that school. And they've been nice to him and given him a lab. But there's the clay change. And I had found some turtles over here. I was showing them. And Randy goes, hey, there's some bones over here. And we came around here. You'll see this rock in a few pictures. And certainly this whole area here, little bones all over it. And you see, you got this little mound right there. And that's not from digging. That's a natural little mound of some sort. You can see it right there. As where the bones coming from is really right in here. So this isn't from us. This is, just deposition, maybe gophers out of that rock, I think. But if you look at this, there's some juvenile bones. And I was able to identify those as Dryosaurus almost immediately because there are some beautiful ends of juvenile limb bones among these things, just laying on the surface. And since these aren't swelling clays, when we would work out at the site, we would dump water on it before we left to expose more bone, because water usually hurts bone in the Morrison, doesn't hurt bone here. But this rock is a nice place to brace yourself, because the main productive level is right in there. And it only extends for about a meter, meter and a half. Not a very, very big site, and all the bone is only in this area. Nothing to the sides on either direction. So we did a little tentative dig, we moved that rock, and basically there's the top of the productive level. And we're really, most of that's actually a bit above the top. There's that little bush, which is really the most productive stuff right there. And, we teased it, we dabbled in it a little bit because I want to figure out its lateral extent. And basically, at that point, I said, let's hold off. See if we can get Rod Sheets involved, since Rod Sheets has already been involved with working with baby dinosaurs. See if we can get Rod involved looking at stuff, and never happened. Sadly, in some ways, I'm still happy that this site is still pristine sitting here. No one has ever done more than we did on that site, other than pick up new bones as they weather out. Here's the kind of material, juvenile bones. That's a little fibula right there. That's the end of a baby fibula. That's the end of a femur. Here's the end of a little femur. That's probably a radius, baby radius. Vertebra, juvenile vertebra, baby vertebra. These compare to the stuff that Rod Sheets was finding and the baby stuff at his site. Phalange, back of the skull, brain impression, tiny tooth. So as we go through this stuff, there's part of a humerus, juvenile. This is, it's not in this picture. That shouldn't be there. That's probably, oops, let me go back. I'll leave it. But these are all baby bones. And there's that tooth sitting off of Lincoln's nose right there. And you see the bone, the teeth that Rod had are even smaller than this. And this shows wear on the tip of the tooth. Basically, his things, which are maxillary teeth, or dentaries, may be from things that were still in the eggs when the site was bulldozed into. But very small animals. But I've also heard that they can wear their teeth in the eggs, basically grinding their teeth, getting ready to eat solid food when they get out of the eggs. So once again, two size classes, juveniles and babies. Why are the juveniles there? And, people need to do work on it. I mean, someone needs to do a statistical study to prove this, but the collections exist. It's just going to take someone to do the work. I'm all over the board. I do a lot of things, but this is a low-hanging fruit project for somebody to do. But basically, we have two size classes, what I think are yearlings and babies. And my thought has been, the hypothesis that I put out, is that when these animals hatch from their eggs, they're pretty clearly precocial. So the joints are well developed and they can follow the adults away from the nest when they leave the nest. Because of this, they would follow like ducklings and basically learn what's edible and what isn't, and how to behave in the environment by mimicking their adults. So patterning after the adults, teach them what to eat and some of the behaviors and things to avoid. And my view is when the adults come back to the nest, because they're seen to inhabit the same nest more than one time in a row, when they come back to the nest, basically the juveniles that haven't broken away on their own stay there, and perhaps the parent or parents at the nest are fast during the egg laying hatching episode, or largely eat themselves out of everything in the environment around the nest, that's edible to them. Whatever the case is, I think the juveniles that come back all the way back to the original nesting site end up dying on the nesting site. And, perhaps people can study the bone and see evidence of, what might have occurred before those animals died. But there are no adult bones at this site either associated with this nest, just the juveniles and the babies. So anyway, that's my scenario. Prove me wrong. That's your job. 98, I had already published on this site, and Society of Earth Paleo met in Salt Lake City. I had early or mid Cretaceous conference in Grand Junction and Cedar Mountain field trip, but I decided to take everyone out to the FPA. I went to the conference. There's Dave Noman from Cambridge University up there, the infamous Bob Bacher, sitting up there looking at really the prime level for bone at that spot. Not quite sure who this is. I really want to know who it is. But there, of course, someone you all should know well, Don Brinkman from the Royal Tyrrell Museum, sitting there. He's probably going, God, this Kirkland, what the heck is he saying? And there I am looking for babies still. Always of interest. I like this site. Love sitting there picking up float. One of the things we found there, in addition to baby dinosaurs, is we found some vertebra of little terrestrial crocodilians. And you can see, these are not like the centra that we see the juveniles and babies. They have the neural arches attached, and they're procoelous. This is a Usuchian, these are advanced Meso-Usuchian grade crocodilian character. So these are little croc vertebra. They're adults because they have the neural arch attached already firmly to these things. So I interpret this, particularly with that little skull at the young site, that these little crocodilians would take advantage of Dryosaurus nesting areas and raid the nest for eggs and young animals. And if the mother caught them, stomp them on the head, as Mike Skrepnik shows here, this Dryosaurus chasing after the baby. This is a painting Mike did for me as a gift back in 1993. And this was actually the first publication I ever did on dinosaurs. I worked on lots of other fossils prior to this. This is the first paper I ever cut my teeth on describing a dinosaur story, was describing the predator-prey relations of little terrestrial crocodilians and Dryosaurus. And I published this and the mid, I think 19, it may have been 1993 or a year or two later. But once again, there's the clay change. We've now started to look at the Morrison and realize there's a lot of differences in the dinosaurs above the clay change and below it. Like Allosaurus, Jim Madsen seems to be below the clay change, and above the clay change, we get Allosaurus fragilis. We're missing almost the entire Tithonian here, the last stage of the Jurassic, below the Cretaceous in this area. So it's across the whole plateau. So we don't know what's going on there. But I wonder if the giant Allosaurs and sauropods around the top of the Morrison and the Denver Basin might be Tithonian dinosaurs. But I think there's a lot of work to be done on biochronology with dinosaurs in the Morrison Formation. So question, these seem to be different animals. Is this a biostratigraphic difference between this little Meso-Usuchian bunny croc and Fruticampsa? It's low-hanging fruit. Hopefully Jim Clark will publish it. I'm not sure what's keeping him. He returned the loan a long time ago. And another question, are the Dryosaurus species above the clay chains the same as below it? We have two Dryosaurus in the Morrison. Dryosaurus altus, the original taxon, and newly named Dryosaurus elderi for the Dryosaurus Dinosaur National Monument. What is the distribution of these animals? They're very common dinosaurs in the Morrison. These are definitely the deer of the Morrison. They're everywhere. And obviously nesting over a lot of this region. So, what's going on taxonomically? Here's a Dryosaurid from Africa. There's another one from the Wealden in the early Cretaceous. So Dryosaurids are around for quite a while. And it's, people don't like to study these small generic ornithischians, but I think they're a real interesting group to study because there's a lot of fossils typically. Do the prismatic oolithid shells belong to Dryosaurus? I think very likely yes, but has it been proven? We don't have one in an egg yet, so we really can't tell. But I'm pretty comfortable they are the same thing, and they're both widespread animals. But that's what we said about Protoceratops. So, science is, we need data, facts. But once again, here's the nesting site up here above this slab, right about there. It doesn't go over here. It's right there. It's still waiting to be collected. I think that we should move back that whole thing above it, collect it in one piece, airlift it out. It's only, less than half a mile from the road. So it's not that far. I can easily get in here to work it. But, this is a protected area. It's a conservation area. So airlifting it probably make the most sense. But dissect it under a microscope in the lab very carefully to figure out what's going on. And maybe flip it over and do it from the bottom. That might be real interesting because maybe there's intact sections of eggs underneath that we can't tell from looking at the top weathered surface. More prismatic oolithid eggs in Utah. This is a site that I co-discovered with Ken Carpenter, recently been published by my buddy Ed Simpson and his students. His student Lazar was the senior author, and basically they were noting that there's organic material preserved in the eggshell here. Work that they were doing under their state-of-the-art SEM equipment there, their college. But it's right within Utah Raptor State Park that will have its grand opening April 25th. So if you're near Moab, Utah, you got to come to the grand opening of Utah Raptor State Park. Let's get back to the summary slide. Jurassic nesting sites, 152 million approximately, solitary nesters. They've returned to the same nest year after year. Hatchlings are precocial. The nest raiders, clearly we have evidence for terrestrial crocs. I wouldn't doubt small theropods would take on some babies if they had a chance to. But I think they follow the adults up to a year. Reigns of babies and yearlings at the nests. Hadrosaurids, around 75 to 70 million years ago, half as old as this, a lot of time. Colonial nesters, nest site fidelity, very likely. Nest-bound hatchlings has been proposed. Nest raiders, varanid lizards, and truodonts, little theropods. And I certainly would think small theropods would do it there too, in the Morrison. Care for the young in the nest till they're big enough to join the herd, perhaps, as opposed to following the adults immediately. And there's remains of babies at the nests in the areas, but not necessarily this bimodal juvenile and baby bone size range. But proven this hypothesis. Basically, low-hanging fruit. This is something for the next generation of students. The fossils exist. The Dryosaurus stuff is in museums. Collect that nest, but there's big amounts of material available to be studied and analyzed. And I want to thank you. Hopefully you're not all sound asleep and missed the rest of it, but I appreciate you giving me a chance to spout off on our baby dinosaurs in Jurassic. Thank you.
Yeah, I just noted that the age of the Morrison is Kimmeridgian, and of course that's a very interesting and somewhat unusual period of time globally. Is there anything in the Morrison that is likewise unusual that might be linked to kind of this global anoxia and all that kind of thing?
No, not in the Morrison itself. And radiometric ages we have from the very top of the Colorado Plateau region. I'm not going to, I think there may be younger rocks over in the Denver Basin, Oklahoma, and Garden Park. But in the Colorado Plateau region, the top of it's about 150 million. We've got some really good, well-resolved volcanic ash states. And it's like right at the Kimmeridgian-Tithonian boundary. So we're really missing Tithonian. The bottom of the section, the famous radiometric date that everyone says for the base of the Morrison is actually the top of the Somerville. And it's middle Oxfordian. But until I get some good numbers for the bottom of the Morrison, I can't tell you, when deposit, there's a big unconformity there, the J5 unconformity. And I'm naming a unit that sits on that unconformity through southern Utah. That's a good marker bed you can see for miles. So it's worthy of naming. But basically, most of that Morrison with the J5, I've got a J6 at the bottom of the salt wash, and then a J7 at the base of the brushy basin. I think all of that's happening within the Kimmeridgian, which is interesting, that break. And what goes on with that, pole change, that break between the salt wash and the brushy basin is interesting because, no one has proposed any reason for it. But I think, that Paleosol has been described over the years, it's well noted, that it's there and it's at the clay change through the region. So can that tie to something in the oceans? Don't know. But the big thing I'm working on is the fact that the end of the Jurassic is a mass extinction of the entire Morrison dinosaur fauna, which seems to have been similar in character for 10 million years. And then boom, it's gone. And we end up with, in North America, no stegosaurs, Polacanthine ankylosaurs dominant, basal iguanodonts may be coming out of camptosaurs, Dryosaur sauropods that come in from Europe. The only brachiosaur that doesn't appear for another 5 million years above the boundary is Hadrosaurus. It's supposedly closer to Lusotitan from Portugal than Brachiosaurus, which is interesting. So it probably comes in. So we might have wiped out all the Morrison sauropods and the theropods. I mean, no more ceratosaurs. They occur right to the end of the Jurassic in Europe. Megalosaurs like Torvosaurus. Guernii occurs in the late part of the Portuguese Jurassic succession. So megalosaurs go out other than spinosaurs. And that's a branch. Allosaurids. I keep asking people, is there any descendant of Allosaurus anywhere? No. And we have teeth at the bottom as big as my hand. I think they're Carcharodontosaur teeth. And I think they're coming in from Europe at the base of it. And then we've got Therizinosaurs. We now have 4 different genera in the yellow cat at different levels, which is 4 different ones. Now, 3 of which are already named. The big Utah raptor, the Utah raptorines. We may have like 3 or 4 taxa now of those. Only, a couple have been described. I mean, it's a very different fauna than we see below. And it flips the switch with, you might say, the gap errors on the date are 1 or 2 million years. They're also the error on the date of the Maracuigan impact in South Africa, which is the end of the Jurassic. An impact crater, 80 kilometers across. The Shanxi Rise, one of the giant flood basalts in the Western Pacific, that's considered the biggest shield volcano in the solar system, as big across as the Japanese archipelago, dates at the end of the Jurassic. We got some big things happening at the end of the Jurassic, but generally there's no there's no perturbation in carbon isotopes or oxygen isotopes. That time, it's, but a complete turnover of the Euro-American dinosaur fauna. And that to me is exciting. That's my hot topic. And Mona, you're definitely reading an old summary of my work. I've been with the survey more than 25 years now, on the plateau for more than 50, chasing dinosaurs. So I've gotten all my end of career plaques from the Park Service and Bureau of Land Management, all that. So good 50 years, Jim. Retire and let some young people get to work.
Yeah, Jim, really interesting presentation. And I just got a question. Have you had much opportunity to come to Canada and see some of the dinosaur egg sites that we had, north of the border?
In Alberta, yeah.
Like the one of the famous,
and Montana as well.
One of the famous
Yeah,
ones.
totally different setups. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, 75 million years performed. That's longer than the entire age of mammals. Between the Morrison egg sites and the real classic Campanian egg sites to the north. And these Jurassic ones are the oldest eggs in North America that are real eggshell, which is interesting. And the diversity is pretty, there's like 5 taxa and like 2 of them are thought to be bird eggs. And then we got this Prismatoolithus is the dominant eggshell in the Morrison over 2 states, which is interesting. There's some evolution in this stuff between the end of the Jurassic and the Campanian of the northern interior.
So have you had a chance to see the one at Devil's Coulee? It's just across from.
Yeah, I've been over Devil's Coulee.
Of course, that's Cretaceous. That's not Jurassic, but that's.
Yeah, no, these are all Campanian. All the Montana stuff and all the stuff in Alberta are all 75 million years later in time.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, they're much later, and it's part of the, all these animals are guanodontians. Hadrosaurs are very derived to guanodontians. Dryosaurus are the most basal. So I would think this kind of eggshell develops in the guanodontians. We still don't have any, for sure, Hypsilophodon eggs like this. I mean, the Erectodromeus burrow nests don't have eggshell in them that I know of. So they probably didn't have solid eggshells yet. I expect the protos were in burrows. Said that for many years, because the tail standers and the goby, I think, were buried below dunes in their burrows, and all the young protos trying to dig their way out. There's no eggshells associated with any of that stuff. It's pretty interesting. It's like, people basically, okay, dinosaur reproductive behavior. Okay, we've got that nailed. Jack Horner did it all. There's nothing left to do. I think there's plenty to do. I think ankylosaurs follow the parent around. That's why we have these juvenile and subadult groups all together that are from the same hatching at a number of sites in the Gobi. I think they hatch and stick together. Maybe they're following an adult that dug its way out and they couldn't, when the dune collapsed. I mean, there's a lot to be done on this stuff. I wish I was younger, so I can crack the whip over some students.
Okay, well, on that note, we don't have any more questions here. Eric, do you have any questions online? Okay, well, good. Well, thank you very much for a really interesting talk. Really taught me a lot. Thank you very much. And we'll
check you later. Come to Utah and have a visit sometime. Dig with us.
Good. Okay, well, thank you very much.